In 1326, guards at Château Gaillard discovered something that would become one of the darkest legends in French history. Behind the locked door of a tower cell lay the body of Blanche de Burgundy, wife of the man who would become King Charles IV, partially consumed by hundreds of rats she had kept as companions through 12 years of solitary imprisonment. In her madness and loneliness, she had fed them and named them, treating them as the children she would never have. But when illness left her bedridden and unable to defend herself, the animals turned on their keeper, and what remained was so horrifying that official records refused to document the truth, noting only that she had died of natural causes. Blanche de Burgundy entered the world in 1296 as a granddaughter of King Louis IX, which meant her entire existence would be shaped by the political calculations of medieval Europe's most powerful families. The marriage to Charles, Count of La Marque and youngest son of King Philip IV, came when she was 14 years old in 1310, an arrangement that served to bind the Burgundian territories more tightly to the French crown through bloodlines that had already been intertwined for generations. The wedding itself became another display of royal power, though the celebrations meant little compared to what the union represented in the larger game of territorial control and dynastic succession that dominated early 14th century politics. Blanche took her place at the French court and learned quickly that survival in that environment required understanding the unwritten rules that governed every interaction between the various factions competing for influence over the king and his policies. 5 years passed during which she fulfilled the ceremonial functions expected of someone in her position while maintaining the network of family connections that gave her whatever protection she possessed in a world where women of even the highest rank could be destroyed by forces entirely beyond their control. The absence of children during this period would later be transformed into evidence of moral failing when her enemies needed justification for what they planned to do, though the reality was far more mundane given the frequent infertility that plagued noble marriages throughout the medieval period. Philip IV court functioned as a mechanism for consolidating royal power through whatever means proved necessary, which in recent years had included the systematic destruction of the Knights Templar through torture and fabricated charges that allowed the crown to seize the order's extensive properties and wealth. This same apparatus of accusation and prosecution could be turned against anyone who became inconvenient to the king's interests, and the sophisticated network of informants and advisors who managed these operations had perfected the art of manufacturing scandals that served their purposes while maintaining a veneer of moral outrage and legal procedure. Blanche moved through this dangerous landscape believing that her birth and her marriage provided sufficient protection against the kind of attacks that destroyed lesser families, never recognizing that the very mechanisms that had elevated her could just as easily be weaponized to remove her from the political equation entirely. The court existed as a performance space where every gesture carried meaning and every alliance could shift based on calculations that had nothing to do with personal loyalty or moral principle, and by 1314, Blanche had become a liability in ways she would not understand until events had already spiraled beyond any possibility of intervention or escape. The spring of 1314 brought accusations that would reshape the French succession and destroy 3 women who had believed themselves untouchable because of their royal connections. Blanche found herself charged with adultery alongside her 2 sisters-in-law Margaret and Joan, accused of conducting affairs with 2 brothers who served at court and who were said to have received embroidered purses as tokens of affection from the women they had supposedly seduced. The source of these accusations was Isabella, daughter of Philip IV and Queen of England, who claimed to have recognized the gifts when she saw the knights wearing them at court, though the circumstances of her testimony and the timing of her observations have caused historians to question whether she was genuinely reporting what she had seen or whether she had been coached by advisors who recognized an opportunity to eliminate complications from the line of succession. The 2 accused knights were subjected to torture that continued until they provided the confessions that judicial procedure required, after which they were executed in Pontoise with the kind of spectacular violence that served as both punishment and warning to anyone who might consider similar transgressions against royal authority. The women themselves were never granted anything resembling a fair hearing of the charges against them, their guilt assumed from the moment the accusations became public, and the only remaining question being how to punish them without creating international incidents that might damage French diplomatic standing. Margaret allegedly confessed under circumstances that remain unclear and was sent to Château Gaillard along with Blanche, while Joan received more lenient treatment and would eventually be reconciled with her husband after several years of carefully managed negotiations. Blanche received a sentence of permanent imprisonment in the fortress Richard the Lionheart had constructed on the cliffs above the Seine, a location chosen precisely because its natural defenses made it as effective at keeping people in as it was at keeping enemies out. The journey from Paris to Normandy took several days during the summer of 1314, each passing mile carrying her further from any hope of intervention by family members or allies who might have been willing to advocate for her release or at least for more humane treatment during her confinement. When she arrived at Château Gaillard and the gates closed behind her, she became separated from everything that had defined her existence for the previous 18 years, cut off from the social networks and family connections that had given her identity and purpose in a world where women existed primarily through their relationships to powerful men. Her husband Charles made no effort to improve her situation and instead pursued an annulment that would free him to remarry and produce legitimate heirs, which meant that Blanche's continued existence as his wife had become an obstacle to his political ambitions that needed to be removed through whatever legal mechanisms proved available. Château Gaillard rose from limestone cliffs that dropped straight down to the Seine, creating a natural prison from which escape was impossible without outside assistance that would never come. The tower room where Blanche was confined removed her from everything that had previously structured her daily existence, leaving her alone in a stone cell with minimal provisions and no human contact beyond the guards who brought food and emptied waste. The physical conditions deteriorated rapidly as the small budget allocated for her maintenance was either diverted to other purposes or simply forgotten by administrators who had more pressing concerns than the comfort of a disgraced prisoner locked away in a remote fortress. She received basic rations calculated to sustain life but nothing more, and the inadequate nutrition combined with the damp cold of the stone chamber began to damage her health in ways that would accumulate over the years of her confinement. Charles became King Charles IV in 1322 when his older brothers died without producing legitimate male heirs, an event that should have elevated Blanche's status but instead motivated him to accelerate the annulment proceedings that would erase their marriage from official records. The papal annulment arrived the same year he took the throne, granting him permission to remarry immediately while Blanche remained locked in Normandy with no change to her circumstances beyond the final severing of the legal tie that had once connected her to power. The years began to blend together in her cell as one season followed another with no variation except the angle of sunlight through her narrow window and the progressive deterioration of her physical and mental state. She had been raised to command servants and manage households, educated in the skills that noble women were expected to possess, and now she existed in complete isolation with nothing to occupy her time except the endless repetition of days that offered no hope of change or release. The guards who attended to her basic needs viewed her as a troublesome duty rather than as royalty, their interactions limited to the minimum necessary to fulfill their responsibilities without engaging with her as a person who might have thoughts or feelings worth acknowledging. Her world contracted to the dimensions of the stone cell and the view through a single window that showed her nothing but sky and the tops of trees growing on the cliffs below, a perspective that emphasized her separation from the normal world where people moved freely and made choices about how to spend their time. The isolation worked on her mind in ways that would have been predictable to anyone who understood what prolonged solitary confinement does to human psychology, breaking down the mental structures that allow people to maintain their sense of self and their connection to reality when deprived of social interaction and meaningful activity for extended periods. Something fundamental broke in Blanche's mind during those years of absolute isolation, though the exact timeline of her psychological deterioration cannot be reconstructed from the fragmentary records that survive from Château Gaillard. The rats that lived in the fortress walls began to feature more prominently in her existence, moving from being merely another unpleasant aspect of medieval prison life to becoming the focus of her attention and eventually the only form of companionship available to someone who had been completely cut off from human society. She started feeding them deliberately rather than trying to keep them away from her food, setting aside portions of her already insufficient meals to scatter across the floor of her cell and watching as the animals emerged from cracks in the stonework to eat what she provided. The behavior progressed from simple feeding to more elaborate interactions as she began talking to the rats as though they could understand her, creating narratives about their lives and relationships that filled the silence of her confinement with something other than the sound of her own breathing and the drip of water down the stone walls. She gave them names and treated them as individuals rather than as the interchangeable vermin they actually were, constructing a fantasy world in which these creatures represented the court she had lost and the children she had never been permitted to have. The rat population grew exponentially once they had a reliable food source and no natural predators in the sealed environment of her cell, multiplying until hundreds of them filled the small space with their constant movement and squeaking. She welcomed their presence and even their physical contact, allowing them to crawl over her body and nest in her clothing, seeking warmth from the only living things that would come near her after years of enforced solitude. The guards noticed the rats spilling out whenever they opened her cell door but did nothing to remove them, either because they did not care about the conditions of her confinement or because they had concluded that a prisoner occupied with her animals was easier to manage than one demanding human interaction or attempting to harm herself out of desperation. The rats became central to whatever remained of Blanche's identity after isolation had stripped away the social roles and relationships that had previously defined who she was, and she dedicated herself to their care with an intensity that would have seemed incomprehensible to anyone who had not experienced the same level of deprivation. Medieval rats carried diseases that were lethal to humans, and their bites frequently resulted in infections that could kill in an era before effective medical treatment. But for Blanche they represented connection and purpose in an existence that had been reduced to nothing but waiting for death in a stone cell where time had lost all meaning beyond the cycle of light and darkness visible through her window. Early in 1326, after spending 12 years in conditions that had destroyed both her physical health and her mental stability, Blanche developed some illness that left her unable to rise from the thin mattress that served as her bed. The exact nature of the condition cannot be determined from the limited documentation that exists, though the symptoms were severe enough to render her completely bedridden and unable to care for herself in even the most basic ways. The rats that had become dependent on her regular feeding found themselves suddenly without their expected source of food, and hunger began to override whatever learned behaviors had governed their interactions with her during the years when she had been healthy enough to maintain the routines that structured their relationship. At night the animals grew bolder in their approach to her motionless body, testing her flesh with their teeth to determine whether this thing that had fed them might now serve as food itself. The first bites were exploratory and tentative, small wounds on her extremities where the skin was exposed and accessible, and she may have been too weak to defend herself or perhaps too far gone with fever and delirium to fully comprehend what was happening to her in the darkness of her cell. The rats, once they tasted blood and encountered no effective resistance, began feeding on her in earnest, their numbers and their hunger making them fearless as they gnawed away at her flesh through the long medieval nights when no guards would be checking on a prisoner who had been forgotten by everyone except the minimal staff required to maintain the basic functions of her imprisonment. The process continued for some unknown period of time, days or possibly even weeks, as her condition deteriorated and the rats grew more aggressive in their consumption of the body that had once nurtured and protected them. When guards finally entered her cell following some schedule or perhaps responding to the absence of any sounds from behind her door, they discovered remains that were so disturbing that official documentation refused to describe what had been found beyond noting that Blanche de Burgundy had died of illness during her 12th year of imprisonment at Château Gaillard. She was buried without ceremony in a church near the fortress, her grave marked with minimal information and no indication of her royal connections or her marriage to a king, just another body committed to the ground with the basic rites that Christian practice required. The story might have disappeared completely into the gaps and silences that characterize medieval historical records, except that the circumstances of her death were too shocking to remain entirely secret, and over the following decades a legend developed at court about the queen who had been devoured by the rats she kept as companions. The tale was repeated through the 15th century and beyond as a cautionary story about the consequences of betraying marriage vows and defying royal authority, though the reality was more complicated than simple moral instruction could capture. Blanche de Burgundy had been born into the highest levels of European nobility and raised with every expectation of a life defined by power and privilege, but she died alone in circumstances of profound horror after spending more than a third of her life locked away in a stone cell where isolation destroyed her mind before her body finally failed. The rats she had fed and named, treating them as substitutes for the human connections and the children she had been denied, became the instruments of her final destruction when illness left her unable to maintain the artificial relationship she had constructed with creatures that had no capacity for loyalty or gratitude beyond their immediate need for food and survival.